Sykes, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you as well as the ranking member for holding this hearing today, kicking us off for this rail subcommittee hearing. As you all know, on February 3rd, 2023, a Norfolk Southern train carrying hazardous materials derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. To prevent a potential explosion, a controlled burn was also ignited, spewing these chemicals into the air and sparking health concerns for Ohioans and Pennsylvanians alike. What occurred in the 2 years following, no one should have had to deal with the horror and the fallout of such a disastrous derailment, which has impacted this community and continues to impact this community. So one of the things that I did, and after being a member of Congress for less than a month, was introduce a bill with my colleagues, a bipartisan bill from Democrats and Republicans in Ohio, the Rail Act, which was a piece of legislation to address the needs of the community. And, you know, we heard from folks in East Palestine, Ohio, we heard from labor unions, we heard from stakeholders, and we put this bill together hoping that we could address the issue of rail safety. And one of those provisions specifically came from our governor, Mike DeWine, which was around the temperature threshold requirements for safety placards, because what we found in the subsequent report was the first responders went looking for the placards, but they had melted, and they had no idea what they were dealing with. And, you know, I bring that up because the work that many of us have done, you heard from my colleague from Pennsylvania, our colleague from Texas, who have been trying to figure out a solution to this issue, yet we have no solution to this issue, and people in East Palestine are still wondering why Congress refused to act. We heard a lot of criticism of the former president not showing up. The current president did show up. We still have no legislation that addresses the needs of the people, not only in East Palestine, Ohio, but all across the country who have been subjected to train derailments and had their lives turned upside down. And I'll briefly share a story because I was speaking to a law school class earlier this week, and they were asking me about the Rail Act, and one of the students asked, well, with the fact that we now have a Vice President Vance, who was the co-lead for the Railway Safety Act, do you think that we will see train safety in the future? And my response was no. And they waited for me to say something else, but my response was no, because after ruining these people's lives in East Palestine and constantly begging for hearings, having 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of the bill, trying to find a solution that would ultimately address the needs of everyone, we still have nothing. And as my colleague from Pennsylvania said, I find that to be wholly unacceptable. It is unacceptable to have not done anything for the people of East Palestine, Ohio, and all across this country who are concerned. And so I was going to ask you, Mr. Jeffries, what could we do? What would you be okay with? But my colleague had already answered this, and you've answered the question, so now I know. But I am going to ask Mr. Cassidy, what are some of the things that you suggest that we could do? Because at this point, I just want you all to be on the record of expressing solutions that we can hear, that we can put to paper, and then we can implement and keep our community safe.
Sure, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. East Palestine brought to light a lot of failures within the system of railroading. And defect detectors are kind of at the center point of that. And the purpose of the defect detector is it's a wayside detector. It lets you know if there are defects in the cars of the train, if there are trending indicators to give a heads up that something might be going wrong. You know, like in a car when you have wheel bearings, if those bearings start to seize, temperature, obviously you have metal on metal, friction takes place, and you have temperature that rises. Historically, at least from when I hired on in 2005, these defect detectors gave you audible warnings. When you hit one or when you started to go over one, it gave you an introduction. You know, CSX, milepost, blah, 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 defect detector, just to let you know it's on. And then as you went over it, if there's a defect, it would sound an audible alarm, and then it would give you a closing announcement saying CSX defect or milepost, blah, 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 this is what the issues are. But then somewhere along the way, we lost the priority of those communications, and defect detectors started turning off the entrance alarm. So you didn't know if they were working or they weren't working. And then somewhere else along the way, and the next step in the transition is that railroads decided that they didn't want to give the operating crew that information about the defects, that they were better suited to determine whether there was a defect, it should be appropriate, should be reported or not. And then we get into the temperature thresholds like you addressed. You know, there should be a standard on those thresholds. There should be a point at where we need to say, hey, look, you've got to be notified of it. But to Congressman Moulton's point earlier too, there's no reason we shouldn't be in a place where technology doesn't exist that's providing real-time information to the crew and the cab of the locomotive, because that's who needs that information. We're not going to keep operating a train when we know there's a problem behind us. You know, we're the ones that are responsible for its operation. We're the ones whose lives are at stake, and we're the ones that want to make sure that we get the job done the way we're supposed to. If there's any one thing in East Palestine, Palestine that we can fix, is making sure that the defect detectors are communicating, that they're relaying the information to the crew, to the people that have to have it in real time, and getting those things done. But the Rail Safety Act, Rail Safety Enhancement Act did approach a lot of those issues.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know we're out of time, but I'm in this committee to make sure that we figure out these solutions and implement them, and I look forward to working with everyone in order to do that. Thank you for letting us go over, Mr. Chair. I yield back.